Beatie Wolfe writes exquisite melodic songs full of magic chords and dripping tunes that reflect the promise of the 1960s but somehow embrace the 21st century. She does the full 360 painting. This is pop culture that embraces fashion, style, ideas, and technology. And she's played a series of remarkable gigs, whether beaming her music into deep space or embracing the power and the magic and the beauty and the violence of nature, as well as making and recording an album in Montegu Square, the home of Jimi Hendrix, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, and many others. This is a direct line into the heart and soul of pop culture when it was facing up to the future. Also, incidentally, her father was one of the Beats, friends with Ken Kesey, Neal and Allan Ginsberg. And as she relates in this interview, she didn't even know about this fantastic and interesting quixotic background till her later teenage years. And even that story's nothing compared to hers.
They were quoting Terry. And yeah, and then, realized that he was this whole sort of cult figure. And like, yeah, it was kind of funny.
So did your dad, was he quite a good friend of Terence McKenna then, or is...
Oh, they were best friends. I mean, yeah. No, he was really his best friend. And he also, my dad being a very curious character himself, he, originally he came to the UK because he was with the Stones, and he ended up living at Stargroves where the Who and Led Zeppelin, Stones, and all of those guys recorded, because he was best friends with Chris Jagger. But on Terry's side, what was the thing that was really interesting? Oh yeah, so very recently I was having a chat with this Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo, and we were chatting about all this stuff, and I realized that I had no, I kind of, there's so much I don't know, because my dad never really told anyone anything. We grew up with him as this rare bookseller dealing in science and natural history and liking classical music, and had no idea about this other life. So I sort of just randomly thought, okay, I'll just Google my dad's name and Terry's name, and found that there's this whole book on the history of DMT, and really about DMT and how it began, kind of how it the origins of it. And it started with my dad giving Terry some DMT that he got from Ken Kesey, and that was sort of the whole beginning of Terry's exploration into that. So yeah, there's this long chapter from this book that is online that is just quite amusing when you're reading about it, as that's your a parent, that you literally have no idea that ever happened. Or
he was on the car radio one day and he just happened to say, oh, there's a line in this song about me, and that's you Googled him.
It's so that was when I was about 15, 16, and I was into music very much at that point in terms of writing my own stuff, and I had this kind of not a super close relationship with my dad, so there was a thing where if we were in the car together, I'd try and play music because he wouldn't always chat, so it'd be kind of uncomfortable, so put on something that I wanted to hear. And I just got really into the Stones, and I was playing Sympathy for the Devil, kind of thinking like, oh, he would hate this stuff, and he's probably like judging me or whatever, and he was turning it down, I was turning it up, and it was this really awkward moment. And then at the end of the song, under his breath, he goes, there's a line in this song about me. And I just remember being like, kind of, who the hell's this person, sitting next to me? And he didn't expand on that. He didn't tell me, any other details. I was sort of like, like, what? You know, I thought maybe he was joking, but it doesn't really joke in that way. So yeah, he really was very, he just didn't really share that information, you know. And you know, now later on, like, we've talked about some of it more, but it was really like having two lifetimes, you know, where he'd had this whole sort of very, not like hippie experience, because you know the beats weren't like that, and but it was this very like, you know, kind of interesting, like lived in Tibet in a monastery and lived in India, and you know, very kind of like nomadic existence. And you know, he was a poet and he was a lyricist and he wrote for people and stuff, and that was, and you know, obviously very interested in the whole mind expansion sort of fields. But and then when he came, you know, he was in the UK and he was at Stargroves for a while, and then I think he just didn't want to go back to America, but obviously realized he couldn't live there forever. So he sort of ended up, you know, working in a hard rock cafe cutting onions, and you know, I think he was offered shares and he turned them down, thinking like, this will never go, you know, hard rock cafe, what? And then and you know, he hadn't, you know, he dropped out of school when he was 15, 16. So I think there was a big thing of like, yeah, not feeling really qualified, you know, in that way. But he was incredibly smart, and he ended up as a apprentice for a bookseller. And the bookseller realized he knew more than, you know, my dad knew more than he did about certain science and natural history books. So and yeah, and then just like he started working in that field. My mom and him met, I think, through Generation X's manager, because she was working on the punk stuff.
John
and
Crevine.
they were, huh?
Is it John Crevine or Andy Tchaikovsky?
Yeah, I'd have to, you know, but that's again, yeah. Well, and also again, because my mom was so kind of quiet about all of the punk stuff, so like I didn't even learn about that until I was an adult and in New York, having like one of my first interviews. And the guy who was interviewing me, Craig Marks, had ended up finding a copy of her book and of the film. And you know, halfway through this coffee was like, oh, I got a copy of, you know, Shockwave, or whichever version he got. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, you know, your mom's punk book. And so both of them, they obviously, like, there was this thing where they, you know, and they met over this dinner, and my mom had been reading you know, Kool-Aid Acid Test, and was describing it in all this detail. And my dad wasn't saying anything, and she was thinking sort of similar to the Sympathy for the Devil thing. Oh, he probably, you know, doesn't like any of this stuff, or doesn't know about this stuff, whatever. And at the end of this very long description she'd given of the book, you know, under his breath, he was like, I know, I was there, you know. And she said it was like this character jumped out of the pages. So
is he actually on the bus then?
You know, he didn't end up going, and there's a whole story why, but you know, he was, yeah. And again, that story is sort of half told, but he's been sharing quite a lot of I don't know, just some of those accounts with me, and some of those stories, and you know, living with Ginsberg in New York, and you know, the many sort of road trips with Cassady and what that was like. And so, but I think what
was that like? Was that just,
well,
you just sat there and just listened for like 40 hours?
yeah. No, and you know, I think that I don't know, I think with both of my parents, there's an interesting thing where they're, you know, they've both been part of like a sort of a cultural, like, you know, awakening that now was really even more like, you know, romanticized or revered. And I think both of them, just in their own different ways, you know, very private, but also sort of saw a lot of that, the glory of that, or how it was sort of romanticized as just not being, you know, really what they how they related to it, particularly when like a lot of my dad's friends died and a lot of the bus stuff was really dark, you know. So it's sort of that thing of like having seen the reality, and almost being interested in just you know, the people for what they have to offer, and how you know, loving or like honest, or in how much integrity they have, you know, and not sort of getting swept up with a lot of the stuff that I guess we then later look back on and apply these sort of these very heroic, you know, these heroic ways of seeing certain things. And
it's interesting that you were already on the path before you even found out what they were doing, because initially, if you knew that background, you would say, well, it's inevitable you're going to end up making music with parents like that. But you didn't know they were just, you thought they were completely dry parents. And in a way, you were making music in that classic way of like, I'm just going to go off and do in this direction, not the world you're interested in. But so you were actually going there anyway.
Oh, absolutely. And that was the really bizarre thing about it. You know, my dad was constantly anti-music, you know, in terms of, I say that and that sounds mean, like he loves music, but and ultimately now he's obviously really happy I did what I felt was right. But we would have, you know, major arguments where he was like, you're never going to make any money, you know, it's do something else. And, you know, the classic stuff of just like feeling your parent doesn't understand your vocation or your passion. And he was very hard, you know, to get on side about that. With my mum, she was much more supportive, like from the beginning. But yeah, like I knew her as a therapist and a writer, and you know, she'd like twiddle your toes if you had, you know, she was very alternative and was always like campaigning against asbestos, you know, issue, like different, you know, issues in the community and girls playing football and at school and stuff like that. So she was always a badass, you know, and pretty scary, but very like clean and very strict. So like, yeah, finding out about a lot of that, the punk stuff, it was just like, oh, you know, it was really not something I would ever have thought she was part of, you know. So yeah, so it was, in that way it was nice, because as you said, you're kind of choosing what path feels right for you, and then you're obviously finding out along the way that there are more similarities than you realized with with the people that, you know, brought you into this world. So
what was the first music that you felt like was your own? You know, what's every generation's got that kind of zeitgeist alpha band or whatever, you know, the one that only that generation understands, you know, that one you think, wow, there's more to music than just boy bands, you know, the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from a very young age, like again, growing up with my mom and the kind of music she had, but like, you know, the first song that really imprinted was Elvis Love Me Tender, and that was when I was 6, and I was playing it on the keyboard and just thinking, like, obviously playing it very basically, not like, you know, not like some music like prodigy at age 6, but just realizing what a beautiful song it was and how perfectly crafted a song it was. And so that's a memory that just really stayed with me, of sort of learning that and learning it from almost the inside, and then seeing like, wow, this is great songwriting. And, you know, and then really like the record that made me want to make a record was when I was 8 and I was in south of Portugal in this tiny fisherman village where my mom now lives. So we would go out there. That was kind of the place where me, my brother and my mom would go, you know, for holidays, but it wasn't really holidays. It was like a second home. We knew a lot of the people there, Portuguese, German, a lot of friends. And we stayed above this crazy restaurant bar that, you know, was genuinely run by by just the craziest people I think I've, you know, people that actually reminded me, if I had ever experienced, you know, if I had ever met Kesey and those people just from my dad's stories, like it was like another version of that. And I remember Blood Sugar Sex Magic, whether it had just come out or it had been out for a while, but they'd got it at the bar and they were just playing it on repeat. And, you know, the one of the guys was sort of singing. Now I look back and I'm like, it's impossible to tell that story without people like getting really, you know, disconcerted. But he was singing Suck My Kiss with, you know, all of these like this passion and these sort of gestures, and I just thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever heard, you know. And that sort of raw energy, it just electrified me. And, you know, my mum of course was horrified because she was thinking this is so inappropriate, and, you know, Dad's gonna hear about this, and, you know, like I'll, you know, just because they weren't together. So she banned me from buying it, from listening to it. But when we got back to the UK, I found a friend's brother who could part, because he was, you know, 16 or whatever. So he bought the record, and I sat in my bedroom and wrote out every single word of that album, which was such a weird thing to do because there were the liner notes, you know, so you had all the lyrics, but I was just obsessed with it. And I can still sing the whole record. And, you know, and that's the thing with that album, it's like the way, you know, track 3 would transition into track 4, and, you know, in terms of musically and just the architecture of the whole album, but then also the production of it just having so much space and allowing it to be raw in the performance, but also incredibly well captured. You know, it just, even talking about it now, yeah, I just feel like that energy. And I think that was what really made me sort of realize like what great, you know, really the power of like capturing an amazing performance that doesn't have to be perfect, but just has that right energy and feeling, you know.
I mean, initially, were you going to be a writer? Did you go to Goldsmiths or something like that? And
yeah, I mean, I didn't know what, I never was like, oh, I'm in terms of education, you know, I never really fully understood it in the sense of like, I don't know, I just always felt that there was a lot that was being missed out, you know. And I spent most of my time in my early school in the music studios, you know, that's where I kind of was making up songs and whatever. And so I guess I just always knew I wanted to be, I think writing songs, you know, being a lover of stories, you realize that actually, yeah, songs are just another form of storytelling. So I'd been such a, you know, as a kid, you know, putting on plays or like writing newspapers or doing radio shows, like any form of storytelling, I was kind of, that's how I'd spend my time. But then realizing you could put stories to music, it was like, oh, wow. And, you know, that I started writing songs when I was about 7 or 8. So that was just the thing that felt natural. And I didn't really think like, I never really thought career. I just thought, oh, this is the thing that feels really right for me and feels really good. But I loved writing. So I thought, well, you know, as I kind of started considering that maybe I would go to university, which wasn't necessarily part of the earlier plan, but at points, then I thought, well, you know, I'd really like to be the best writer I can be so that I can write great songs, but also I can apply this to other things as well. You know, and Leonard Cohen, who I did discover sort of a bit later on, but ended up doing a dissertation on him for my university degree, which at first was like, you know, the whole department basically said, this is an irrelevant subject. And if you write about him, you know, it will likely fail. So you should do someone like Joyce or whatever. And that was the first real crossroads situation where I saw how disconnected it was to regurgitate, you know, something else that so many people were doing, when I had such a passion for a particular kind of way of looking at this artist, or, you know, just even the artist's work, that I felt was really, you know, original and really interesting. And so I ended up doing it, you know, and that got the top mark in the year, but it also ended up connecting me with Leonard Cohen. So it was this amazing realization of, like, the grade was so irrelevant anyways, but not only did it get a better grade than I would have got with anything else, but it connected me with so many things that were part of the bigger picture, you know, of life. So that was sort of a really great way, before I got into some of the stuff I did later on, some of the projects, of seeing that actually when everyone's telling you it's a bad idea, or it's impossible, or it's not worth doing, and if you can see it really clearly, then it's usually the best time to do it.
There is no impossible, is there?
No.
I'm interested in the idea of the projects. You talk about storytelling. These projects create stories, and also kind of knowing your background now, and say where your mother and father came from, people, great mythological stories, you know, punk, Ken Kesey, all these things. The culture is about the story, isn't it? It's bigger, and all the things you've done. I just wonder if you're trying to make sense of your music, and also your parents as well. You know, is this, you know, I'm thinking specifically of the Montegu Square, which is so quintessentially 60s, the whole scene round there. But you've done a modern version of it, in a sense. It's telling an old story in a modern way. So one is the art of storytelling's in there, and two is this is it an attempt to come to terms with the 60s, the hangover of the 60s, which is part of your family?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I just think I spent my childhood in just a world of imagination. Like, it's just how I guess I saw, you know, the world around me, and sort of how it made sense, you know. So this was before I even knew, like, even a hint of some of the stuff connected with the family. And so, you know, then just, and I've talked about it a lot, but it was the kind of foundation of everything that came after, was the discovery of, you know, my dad's record collection, and having already started writing songs myself, but then seeing these sort of tangible musical books, you know, you could open up and read like a story, and there was the artwork, and, you know, the sense of ceremony, and this feeling of entering into the world of the album. I just spent so much time imagining, you know, what those worlds would feel like, and what they would look like. And, you know, it was sort of as if that was my whole, like, that was everything before I released the first record, was just imagining what the album experience could be like. So, you know, obviously then with the first record, it was just when we moved to iTunes, and realizing that my first album wouldn't have this tangible art form that I saw at the core of music, really, the music listening experience. I felt like, well, there has to be another way of thinking about it. There has to be a way of combining the best of the old, the best of the new, the best of the physical, best of the digital, and essentially creating something that people had never experienced before, that still has the magic of that tangible art form, but is also an entirely new way of looking at music, and of sort of being present with it. So with Montegu Square, which was the second record, it, you know, like Raw Space, and, you know, and this does sound very esoteric, because it is, but, you know, there was no real will to do anything like that. It really happened because
you know, I'd done this first album, which was this, you know, Theatre for the Palm of the Hand, and everyone was like, what are you going to do for the next one? And I was like, probably nothing, you know, like, because I'll never do anything for the sake of it. So I had a blank slate, you know, I had a blank space in terms of, you know, what could be inspiring or what could present itself. And I ended up very serendipitously, you know, running into this tailor who dressed very Hendrix Jagger, who happened to live at 34 Montegu Square, which was the home of McCartney, Lennon, Yoko, Hendrix, Ringo, you know, who all lived there consecutively. And he was like, oh, well, you know, would you like to come over for a cup of tea? So I go over there and I see the Lennon plaque, and, you know, but we're sitting in the front living room, and I have no idea about really any of the other history apart from, okay, so Lennon was obviously here, you know. And he starts telling me, and, you know, you I know this, but it was just so incredible. You know, Ringo bought the flat. It was his home, also his place he would sort of rehearse in and stuff. And then he leased it to McCartney, who wrote and recorded Eleanor Rigby in this room that we were sitting in. McCartney then had his Zappo HQ out of there for a while and was recording William Burroughs and all these beat poets. And then Hendrix comes over and needs somewhere to stay, and McCartney's like, oh, okay, you know, I'm moving out, do you want to come live here? And Hendrix moves in, and after some big argument with his girlfriend, she storms out. He writes and records The Wind Cries Mary in this same space. And then finally he gets evicted for, Ringo asks him to leave because he's whitewashed the walls when he was high on acid. And then, you know, Yoko and Lennon move in, and that's where they do the Double Virgins, you know, cover. And as he's telling me, I literally just feel like the resonance of this space is so incredible. And I'm thinking about him as a tailor and what he's done, and I'm thinking about this house and what this house holds, even this room holds, in terms of, like, you know, the songs that have been written there, everything that's passed through there. And I'm thinking about the album jacket, which is an aspect of the record I loved so much, that told, again, such a big part of the album story. I'm thinking, well, there's something obviously here with creating a new type of album jacket that is literally a jacket woven with music that's recorded in this space, infused with all of that resonance and history. And then the fabric is cut by this tailor into this one-off piece that is kind of like, you know, a way of literally looking at music as art, you know, that you're wearing, and is of course a reimagining of the record jacket. So, but it was like pulling the thread, you know. And I always feel like when something sort of piques your interest, or really it's not even interest, it's the inspiration, and you just kind of follow that, and then these other layers start to come in, and then you're like, oh, this is wonderful, because actually people can enjoy it just as the music alone. They can, you know, so the tracks on that record have got that sort of 60s vibe. It wasn't done again, it wasn't architected like that. It was more a question of, once I had the story, how would you curate the right music for the story? Because I always have so many songs in the song bank. But it's like people can enjoy it just on that level, or they can, you know, dig deeper. And obviously the story of the jacket, there are so many wonderful layers where, like, that space on its own, fascinating, you know, the tailor on its own, fascinating. Like, it's sort of this way, I think, of I don't know, like, obviously mixing the old and the new, but also almost creating portals in time that connect you back with these other moments, and are often, again, this very multimedia experience that is combining art, music, technology, science, you know, history. And I love that idea that this physical touch point can actually provide a link to all these other worlds or stories, really.
I like the idea. It's a total immersion music is not just music, is it? As you're saying there, it's everything. It's it is the outfit, the flat, the room, the people were there, the drugs they were on, whatever, the way the hair was, you know, the whole thing's 360, spherical, isn't it? And what you've done with that record there is a total immersion into a heart of probably one of the great prime cultural post-war moments, isn't it? And you went to the flat as well, didn't you?
Oh yeah, so you know, the music was recorded in that space, in that room.
Do you feel the ghosts in there?
Yeah, but actually, yeah, but it was almost like it was almost like, and the Taylor said the same thing. It was almost like we were puppets, you know, because there were so many things that should have gone wrong, like a whole load of stuff in terms of timings and like just being able to even do that and whatever, and everything was so smooth, and it was it, and you know, and actually the people, because we had a sort of very select audience that was there, and like, you know, you get some pretty straight kind of music guys, you know, journalists, and they were like, oh my god, you can, yeah, you can feel the spirits in this room, and you really could, you know, you really could. So
I like that.
I think it's just
the idea that not only in that room, but if you're making music, the feeling the spirits isn't that what, even if you're writing in a bus station in Hereford, you should be feeling the spirits. But it'd be more difficult if they're going to be there, aren't they? Maybe that's the role of a songwriter, to tap into that.
Well, yeah, and I think the tapping in, I think that's exactly right, where, you know, it's sort of, and we talked about it when we first chatted, but it's that intention as well. I think when you're tapping in with a certain intention, it does connect you with this sort of whole, like, not web, but it's like you end up finding these connections and these magical things that end up creating a sort of even more fully realized experience. And I think that intention is really key, because, you know, you're sort of tuning in, you know, your intentionality is also tuning in with actually probably a lot of those artists' intentionality with what they were doing and why they were doing that, you know, at the time, which is rarer today in terms of, you know, in some ways in terms of the artistic, you know, creation process.
So, I mean, I listen to your music, yeah, obviously it's melodically very strong, but it's more important to create an atmosphere or capture that atmosphere than even the melodies, or both equally important.
I think it's sort of everything. It's the, you know, it's like the feeling. I was watching a performance of Nina Simone the other day, and when she's doing this song Stars, and it's just completely transfixing, because it's like that she believes not every word, but every nuance of what she is doing. It's like she embodies it, you know. So I think when you embody something, then every part of the expression feels real. And so whether it's the melody, or then how you sing the melody, or the tone of the voice, or the articulation, or, you know, the space within it where the notes are, it's like every part of that ends up being, you know, hugely important in that realization. And so that's sort of the whole thing of when we were talking about it from the other side of obviously how much technology can get in the way of that. It's because human expression is it's so vast, you know, and every single aspect of that expression can produce such a different end kind of experience, really. And I just love that. Like, I guess I just love how original we are and how unique things can be, you know, even when we know there are only so many notes and there are only so many words, and, you know, there are only so many ways of saying the same thing, but it's like, no.
But we know it's infinite. If the way you play guitar, every time you play it, one note is completely different, because the inflection of it, the way you hit the string, the amount of energy you put into it, what you're thinking while you're playing it. Oh my God, it's endless, isn't it?
Yeah.
Try
Yeah.
playing the same thing twice. It's impossible, isn't it?
No, totally. You know, that's the magic.
So you've also done a project where you beamed your music into space. And I thought that was interesting as well, because, you know, the project talk about Montegu Square, people, you could say ostensibly it's an archaeological dig, but it isn't the way you do it. You do make it sound of the now. But what people tend to forget when they talk about people like Hendrix or Lennon, these are forward-thinking people. These were never meant to be historical pieces. These people were going forwards. They were in outer space, you know, they were going that way. And I was just wondering
Totally.
if that was part and parcel of what you were doing with the project with NASA.
Well, yeah, I mean the space broadcast, that happened in like a completely unplanned, totally unplanned way, as I feel like the best stuff often does. You know, there's a Jim Henson quote, and I think he's talking as Kermit, but you know, essentially it's the detours. You know, it's once you put away the map, it's the detours in life that often lead to what life is, you know, which is sort of that same sentiment Lennon had. But yeah, so I've been working on this anti-stream from the Bell Labs anechoic chamber, quietest room on Earth, which was this physical record streaming experience that had, you know, the live animations and lyrics coming out of the record in real time, which essentially was like this Fantasia kind of feeling for the, you know, way of seeing and hearing an album, which was the closest thing to me opening up Abbey Road and feeling like, you know, everything just jumped out as a 7-year-old. So I've been doing that, and you know, and the album happened to be called Raw Space, and it was nothing to do with space. You know, I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was thinking about this anechoic environment that had no EQ, no reverb. It was ultimately this raw space that had this very raw sound. So, you know, while I was working on this, I'd heard about the scientists who used the horn antenna, Bell Labs horn antenna, to pick up cosmic microwave radiation, which then basically proved the validity of the Big Bang Theory. And he'd used obviously the antenna to do this. So I was really interested in this and the horn, and I wanted, you know, we wanted to meet one another because he'd also heard about the work I was doing with Bell Labs. So we met in front of this huge horn antenna, which is, you know, a national historic landmark. It's like this gigantic ear trumpet. And we're chatting, and, you know, I just sort of pose him the question, like, well, you've used this to receive, but have you ever used it to transmit? And he's like, oh, no. And I'm like, well, in theory, could you use it to transmit? Say, for example, could we send raw space into space? And he's like, no, because the sound waves will get to a point in the Earth's atmosphere and then they'll stop. So I thought that was the end of the conversation, and, you know, went away. And after a month, I get an email from him saying, yeah, Beatie, I figured it out. I can do an update on the horn if you still want to do the broadcast. And, you know, he's a late 80s, 90-year-old Nobel laureate, and this is a historic landmark, and he's, you know, up for like updating it and us doing this space beam. Why? Well, why not? So we went back there, and it was really just Robert and myself and like one or two friends, and we did this broadcast, and, you know, and documented it and stuff. And that was 2017. And, you know, then he'll periodically update me on where the music would be traveling at this point in time. And yeah, it just seemed like a wonderful sort of story, because again, it was the story, it was the fact that it was launched from the quietest room on Earth as this sort of Fantasia anti-stream in the streaming age experience, and then from the quietest room on Earth it was sent into the quietest space outside of Earth, And it wasn't the studio version of the album, it was the version recorded in this space without any audio enhancements or, you know, auto tune or any of that stuff. Like the rawest sound imaginable would go into the rawest space. And that just really felt kind of, I don't know, that it inspired me, you know, and it made me sort of feel like, oh, this is a reflection of our humanity right now when everything's becoming so increasingly heavy on the tech, you know. So you mentioned those guys, and I think, you know, Lennon and Hendrix and all of it, and obviously the Beatles and so many of those other artists, they were all so innovative, but they were innovative in an area where they were still keeping the art raw, you know, and they were still keeping the imperfections and the kind of all of that stuff that makes it, you know, move us in the first place. But they were just thinking very differently about how they could, you know, produce, engineer, conceive, you know, all of that stuff. So I think for me, it's always been about knowing where to keep it raw and where to update or augment or innovate. And when those two things work together, it can be really amazing.
Yeah, the technology is the vehicle, isn't it? Really, it's not the dictator, though, is it?
No, you know, and I think, yeah, technology is like, it's at its best when it's totally invisible, when really no one has any idea. And when I say invisible, not in the sense of, you know, because you could argue you could make you know, any aspect of production invisible, but not in that way. But like when it is an invisible facilitator of something core to that experience, you know, when it's adding another dimensionality, it's turning a phone into a theater for the palm of your hand, or a jacket into this, you know, reimagined album jacket, or the, you know, record player into this Fantasia experience. It's like, I always feel like people should never feel like any of the designs I've done are actually technologically advanced. It should just be like, oh, this feels very intuitive and inclusive. You know, you can go up to an old coin operated viewport and watch this album come to life, and everyone from a grandparent to a kid knows how to do that because they've gone to the seaside and they've looked through those binoculars, you know. And it's that aspect of it that is really appealing to me, you know.
So quite often these projects, you have the music. I mean, obviously Montegu Square, you wrote that there, but the other projects is utilising music you've already got and putting it into a different context.
Yeah, and actually a number of the songs from Montegu Square I had already written. So like I think with each record, it's more about because, you know, the songwriting side has always been, in some ways, that it's like a tap, you know, the tap is there and you turn it on or you turn it off, but those songs are kind of always there, and sometimes you'll turn it off and it doesn't matter, you'll still get, you know, a lot of songs coming through. And that can be sometimes, it's funny because, you know, in the middle of one of those big projects like the Bell Labs, the Anti-Stream, I was so focused on just trying to get that realized and executed, and there was obviously a lot of components to that. And then when these songs are coming through, you're sort of like, well, like not now, because, you know, trying to figure out this, you know, whatever it is, ambisonic audio. And so, but the lovely side of that is then when you have the project or you have the concept, then it's like picking the songs that tell that story. And some of them are new and completely new, and some of them are, you know, the first songs you ever wrote. So there's something quite lovely about that, because it's almost like curating your own material rather than, you know, having to create the whole thing.
Mm. And go back, say to your father, but not directly, that idea that, you know, the stories he didn't tell you initially, but these great myths that would get handed down from the 60s and then the punk myths in the 70s. Do you think there's as much mythology in music nowadays, or do you think that's because it's become a very slick operation in the last 10 years, do you think we're losing some of the myths?
Yeah, you know, I do. And I think, I mean, obviously that is for so a myriad of reasons that we also know, like how, you know, well, obviously curation has now been replaced with access, and, you know, value is again, value is also being replaced with access. So we sort of have all this access without really curation, without the same value. And as a result, I think music and art has kind of just become part of, you know, like what we have around us all the time, which is also social media and, you know, all this stuff that's sort of coming in at the same frequency. And, you know, that feedback loop, you know, I'm very nostalgic about letter writing. And actually I've been, during this lockdown, I don't even know how many letters I've written. It's got into the hundreds. And, you know, and it's not to receive anything back. It's that idea of like in those, you know, in times where it was down to those kind of, again, tangible ceremonial dialogue, you know, and sharing these stories as they were happening, and having these kind of loose accounts, you know, some of which were very accurate, some of which were very hyperbolic, you know, but almost having a lot less that existed that physically represented that time, which then could be expanded upon, or could, you know, one, like, you know, Ken Kesey, not Ken Kesey, Cassady writing this, you know, spontaneous poem on my dad's typewriter, which then my dad decided, because he was angry with him, he threw away. You know, that becomes this whole, no, I know, I read that and I was just like, oh man. But, you know, it again, there's so much more value attached to those things that survived, because also, you know, there was, you know, it's like there was a lot less produced. Whereas obviously now it's like, how many photos do we have of us at any given point, you know? So these things are so much better documented from the beginning, to the point of almost like over documented. And as a result, we flipped it where we think we're so interesting. It's like, oh, look at me, I have my social media and I get, you know, people saying this and that, and I can post, you know, a photo of these socks I've received, and everyone's so excited. I'm not saying me personally, but you know, so we've kind of suddenly made it much more of, in some ways, like, you don't have to do a lot to get a big response, you know. Whereas the idea of kind of say, looking at creation, you know, the idea that you would spend so long, if you were Leonard Cohen, for example, architecting Hallelujah, or even if you wrote a song very quickly, you know, and it just came through you and Lennon in a moment, it's like you weren't even thinking about the feedback loop at that point. You were just completely in that sort of point of kind of you know, receiving something, transmission. And so I think when we flip the focus to sort of feedback and how much we're getting back, and also onto ourselves as our own idols, which is now the times that we're kind of living in, I think, yeah, it's hard to both have the same sort of creation process, or the same intent behind the creation process, and then also it's hard for anything to be a myth, because everything is documented within an inch of its life. There's no room for mystery.
Yeah, that's quite a key phrase, no room for mystery. I was kind of also thinking about, you know, that idea of being in the zone to write. I think for me, I think the best stuff comes out of the subconscious, and I think there's so much distraction, it's hard to get into the subconscious because everything is surface. You know, everyone's too busy. And I like Instagram. I think there's some great photographs, and it can be very artful, but it doesn't have those kind of complete life-changing earthquake moments as somebody who's peered into the subconscious and dug it out, like a great piece of music or a great piece of literature or a great painting is. And
Yeah.
you think as an artist, when you're channeling, that's when you're really in the subconscious, and that's where the stuff is.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think it comes from a deep place, you know, and I think it's hard for us to get deep these days, you know, and obviously, yeah, not just, you know, not just saying social media is bad, anything simplistic like that, because there are a lot of that, you know, with any of these things, there are pros and cons, and it's just about there's another tool and how are you using it. It's not that anything is inherently good or bad, it's how you're using it. But I think when you have, you know, notifications, like I think our attention span and our ability to get into that place where we spend 6 hours, you know, completely in our own world, like whatever, doing whatever it is, it's much harder to experience that. And I, you know, I find it with myself, and I'm not even a big, you know, I'm much more sort of conscious of that sort of addictive side. And I think it's also that I really do believe you have to take out the desire to have people, you have to, I think to make really great art, you can't be considering, it's not that you can't think, oh, how will people receive, you know, hear this or receive it, but I think there's something about a purity of just kind of telling that story in that moment the way that feels authentic, where you're not looking at it from the other, you know, it's from the inside out rather than from the outside in. And so I do think that it's hard sometimes to then get in that same kind of place when we're so used to gratification and things being quick and instant. And you know, that's again with letters, like the thing I love about writing a letter is you don't even know if it will get to the person. Yeah. You don't know when it will get to the person. So when you're writing it, you're totally focused on the writing of it, and there's a wonderful sort of ceremonial aspect to that for yourself, you know, just for simply writing the letter. But then to receive it, it's the same thing. You don't know when someone's going to send you something. You don't. So again, it's like, I think anything that gets us out of the usual pathways of the brain that we're so kind of auto-programmed, so anything that breaks that comes in from a different angle, that forces us to like, whoa, sit down with something for 10 minutes or half an hour, in the same way that we'd sit with records for however long, you know, we were absorbed by them. Anything that's coming in from that place, it's amazing how that imprints. And this is the thing about us as human beings, I think we need things to imprint, which is where it goes in such a way that it forever changes us, and it moves us, and it becomes part of who we are and what we carry forward. And I think that when everything is intangible, it's very hard for any of it to imprint. So how do you come in from these different ways where actually, you know, again, like someone say this raw space chamber I did in the V&A that had, you know, everyone from tiny kids through to older people, schools, like a lot of people, you know, experience that space chamber. And I think that will be something that people really remember for the rest of their lives. And that's not like an ego thing. That's not patting myself on the back. It's just saying that combination of being in this sort of NASA grade mylar wrapped space room with this record, which they can listen to in this kind of old school way, but then using a old binocular device, which again, they're familiar with, they look through it and see something completely different with this record, you know, kind of coming to life before them. And it's things like that I'm always thinking about, you know, what are the moments that we will really, you know, take with us for the rest of our life, that will create our help sort of enrich and expand our emotional sensibility, because, you know, that's why we're here.
So I was just thinking, with your father's generation, to get into the zone, I mean, like your father's with Terence McKenna, so that'd be DMT, which is pretty heavy stuff. Kesey was acid. There's all those things going on in the 60s. I mean, you don't have to even answer this question if you don't want to, but how do you get into the zone? I imagine, kind of looking at you, don't look like somebody who's living the same kind of life that your father probably did in the 60s. So do you get in the zone by just playing a chord of guitar? Because it doesn't have to be heavy to get in the zone. Or are you kind of person who can actually go conscious, subconscious quite easily? You kind of flicker between the two without having to take like drugs or meditation or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I think, so I did a lot of, as a teenager, I was a nightmare. And I, did a lot of that stuff when I was really young, like 13, 14. That was sort of part of the reason why it was, not, I never thought I would be at school past 15, so I I guess I saw how close it was, how close you could get to the edge, of your sanity, and sort of after that time. But I also had a feeling like, okay, if you go through this now, you'll never be tempted again. Like that will never appeal to you again. So yeah, since then it's almost like realizing that life, is such a trip, and there's so much around us that we can be inspired by. I know it sounds like a cliche, but nature, and art, like nature and art for me are the two closest things to the divine, so I guess I just feel really, like, I don't know, just really blessed, to be able to do the work that I do, to get so much joy out of it. And whenever I'm working on it, like whether it's a quiet time in terms of like no new projects or new ideas, or the beginning of a new idea, or halfway through that new idea, or the realization of that, it is like a drug, because you get so excited about it. And then obviously that's not even the music side of it, in terms of course it relates to the music, but that's kind of creating the world for the music. So yeah, I think the subconscious thing is something I've never on any level tried to manufacture something, and that sounds very like, it sounds like that's an impossibility, but it really isn't. It's like, obviously, there are times when things have really been difficult and a big struggle, but particularly in recent years, the number, sort of having an idea and then it ending up working out and unfolding, it's really being quite effortless, and those ideas never come from a place of like, oh, everyone's now talking about, this certain new technology or this certain new interesting whatever, and so I should be doing something in that. It's like the opposite. Before Raw Space, I was intent on never doing anything with VR and AR, because I was like, not interested in it at all. But then being in the anechoic chamber and realizing that, like trying to imagine what an anti-stream could look like, and then thinking about this perfect space of real listening and ceremony, and thinking about this physical record player playing, where people couldn't shuffle or anything, they would hear the music in this pure focused way. But then thinking, well, what would bring that to life, and what would be the aspect of, like, all the liner notes and all the artwork that again was so part of the experience, which I thought about with every innovation. It was just so obvious. Oh yeah, you'd use AR, but people wouldn't even know it was AR. It would just look like beautifully hand-drawn lyrics and like the landscape of the songs that would be blending with the room in real time. So like, I guess that's a way of just saying, like, and the same with the song, it always comes from a kind of a very quiet inner place, which then grows, and then it's amazing how those layers start kind of presenting themselves.
So in this kind of period we're in now, it's obviously put a stop to a lot of activities. But have you been creative, or have you got plans? Are you planning what you're going to do on the outside this, or have you got like new another way of presenting the music, or is it, and that at the time kind of reflected into your creativity as well, or you completely sort of separated it out from the creativity?
Yeah, no, so, you know, this room I'm in, since whenever the lockdown began, I've been recording a lot of new songs in here, which feels great because it's sort of going back to when I was 15 or 16, recording on this little 8-track and doing it all myself. So that's felt really good, just to get some of the skills back and have the music be actually probably even rawer, but in the kind of area I like. And then, you know, the next record installation, I already have the concept for it, and it was all kind of ready to happen at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's this way of presenting an album as a secret communication system using code pioneered by Hedy Lamarr in World War II, which is called frequency hopping, which will allow people to discover the album's secret tracks and then explore them spatially. But yeah, obviously museums, as with festivals, as with so much, you know, a lot of that's been kind of thrown a bit of a curveball right now. So then I started thinking, well, if there's an aspect of it where it's limited with people physically being able to be there, how could you create the same experience that people could do from their homes, you know? So actually I had that idea just a week ago, and then spoke to the curator of the Art Institute about developing it in that way. So that's really exciting, because again, I think, you know, it's amazing how limitations, people sort of think obstacles and limitations and, oh, you know, what do you do when that happens? And actually it's like, oh, that's when you start getting creative, you know. If you have everything at your disposal, you know, all the money or all the gear or whatever, it's like it ends up producing quite a lot of crap, as we've seen in many examples from, you know, TV shows, films, albums. But, you know, when you have those limitations, you really then have to kind of know, firstly, why you're bringing something into that space. But it's like, you know, that's when almost the thinking, you know, becomes even more crystallized, because you're like, okay, well, we don't need that aspect of it, so can we reshape it in this way? And sometimes it even produces a better, you know, even a much better iteration. So I'm excited about that. And then I have this environmental protest project, which we, you know, talked about a little bit.
You're back.
Did I lose you?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the environmental protests. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, and that was going to be at a lot of festivals this summer, from like Wall Street, Cannes Lion, and you know, the Global Climate Summit, a bunch of places. And then those obviously all cancelled. But then I'm thinking, well, we're naturally giving the world a bit of a breather just by, you know, reduced travel and all this stuff. So actually that's great to have had a tangible, you know, to not have to go and show a piece if we're actually getting some sort of tangible solution, even if it's a temporary. But that will be at the London Design Biennale next year. So, you know, and just continuing to kind of work on that as well.
Brilliant. Well, for an interview, that's all the stuff I'll need. I mean, because actually
Nice.
hours. There's so many interesting things. Yeah. So I try to get that thing set up with Youth. You know, Youth, the producer.
Oh yeah.
He's John McCartney, Pink Floyd. He's in Killing Joke, the band.
Yeah.
But it's on now, but it was too late because he had everything booked out all day.
No worries.
But I'm gonna get him to get in touch with you, because all the stuff you do is the kind of stuff he's really fascinated by. He's got this amazing studio out in Spain on top of a hill near Granada, and he produced Crowded House. He's done loads of stuff. You know, he's got a hell of a CV, and he's kind of one of those guys. When you talk about the '60s thing, he's really obsessed with that. But forward thinking as well. So I think you probably get on with them quite well, actually. Just that was
Nice.
that was more interested in that happening. Also, there's a project I'm actually doing at the moment. I'm talking to the people at the Eden project, and we're talking about doing some kind of event next year if we can get it off the ground. So it might be quite nice to get involved as one of the guests at that, if that comes off.
Yeah, thanks, John. No, both of those sound great.
Yeah, because the Eden project thing is get all the kind of key interesting thinkers I can get hold of into, whether they're digitally or physically, into one place at once and make interesting stuff happen. It's like looking for ideas in a post-virus world, really. Yeah, because you've got amazing ideas. The stuff you're doing is incredible, really. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
I didn't even realise all that stuff about your dad and that. So I don't want to go on about it too much in interview. So now I just want to ask. This is not in the interview. This is just curiosity. Where did he get his connection with Kesey from? Was it geographical? Was he because he was just up the road, or was it before that?
Yeah, I don't know. So he would have been 62, 63. And this is where, honestly, like he is such an enigma, because there's still so much of this stuff I don't know. He shared this kind of file of stories with me, which I've been reading, and that's where it will, like the cat, throwing away this Cassady letter, and not a poem, and just some of those stories, and being in traveling to New York to live with Ginsberg. But yeah, I don't even know where the Ken Kesey thing came in. And again, it's like he it doesn't volunteer that kind of information. And so, we don't talk super frequently anyway, but it's more like as soon as, so I was chatting with him whenever it was, and I was talking about one of the songs I was working on, and I said about a bounce, and he's like, "What's a bounce?" And I was like, "Oh, it's just this," and then in a sort of very affected, like amusing voice, he's like, "I know all about that stuff. Like, I was trying to fucking sleep when they were recording that fucking Stairway to Heaven song, and I had to go and tell them to shut up because it was going on so long." And you're like, these things where you're like, okay, didn't know that okay. And but I was trying to put my finger on it, because I have, when we talked about it in the interview, it's like, what is it where there's a certain level of contempt, and there is an article about it with Terence and Mike, this article I said that was online about the two of them, where like Terry described my dad as light years ahead of everyone else to find something, and then would be full of contempt by the time any kind of people had arrived on the scene, Yeah. So I think he was just one of these people that, like, when it was this tiny group, or it was this somehow scientific exploration, then he was really sort of passionate about it. But then as soon as it became the kind of Timothy Leary, as soon as it got sort of taken on that road, he was like, just thought it was a load of bullshit, so.
The ultimate hipster then, when it's not hip anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, exactly.
I met some of the pranksters. I met Ken Babs years ago when he came to London and brought the film of the bus.
Oh yeah.
There's a couple of others with him as well. Some of the ones you don't really know the names of. But Ken Babs, I never thought he was a proper prankster. Really, he was out the Marines. He was. He didn't seem to have the wisdom to me.
No.
Whereas Kesey, I never met Kesey, but he's a fascinating character, wasn't he?
Yeah. No, fascinating. No, it really is all fascinating. I guess it's just also that thing of like, you know, the same with the punk stuff, which you would know, like how these things just, yeah, they later kind of, I mean,
They
what's the
get
word?
mythology, yeah. But
Mythologicized.
you must have been places where you know the mythology is going to come. I've been at gigs and you think this is going to be a moment that people will talk about for decades. I've
Yeah.
seen Varna playing rooms to 10 people. I was at the Stone Roses gig at Blackpool. You know those moments where you think, you know, the rest of my life, people about 20 years younger than me will go, that's impossible. How could you be there? But
Yeah.
somebody has to be there, don't they? You know.
No, totally. But I think it's I think that's it with both my mom and my dad. They never, like, my dad was always much more interested in like some scientist who, you know, discovered whatever, like, you know, discovered the quark. Like he saw all that music stuff. It's not like it was, but you know, it was always more like, well, what great thing have you achieved for the world? Like that's what he was always going from. And my mom, you know, my mom on her side again was always like much more interested in someone, if someone had a near death experience, like some spiritual thing, than she was, you know. So I think it's just, I think there is an interesting thing where we do value, as society, we put a lot of value on like certain things, where it's like, well, actually anyone that's contributing something good to the planet, you know. And that's something I've always found is like, I wouldn't be any more excited about meeting Leonard Cohen than I would about, you know, the neurologist Oliver Sacks. Like, it's not, there's this sort of interesting thing with the other side of music and art, which is the whole entertainment thing, where people get put on such a pedestal, and it's like, well, I don't think that part's healthy, you know. I think it's like just doing what you do, you know, with love and like, you know, grace. And there are so many people working in so many different areas that are also doing like just wonderful things, and just, yeah, not getting kind of like, not valuing one more than the other, you know.
I guess there's entertainers and the showbiz, which is great because I love the spectacle. I am from Blackpool after all. But
Yeah.
I'm also fascinated by that shamanic thing, which probably that's more your side, where people tear little holes in reality, and you peer through and think, oh, wow, yeah, there's, you know, then that point in time, you can see the edge of the universe. You can see the subconscious, you can hear a melody, and all those things, ping, they all combine. And the wonder of everything, which comes out of music and art. So even if you look at a piece of lichen or a star in the sky, and it gives you all the same feeling. And that's why the music I truly, truly love more than anything does that to me. And that's going to be that thing at the Eden Project, because the guy who runs that, when I started talking to him, he was into these same ideas. Everything is really fascinating, but music is a little portal. And when you go through, it's like, whoa, now I get everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, and that's like, if you haven't checked out, it might be like not your kind of book, but the work that Sacks, you know, the work that he did looking at like music and all these different conditions, and it is magical. Like things that you could not, you know, people that are in comas, that are catatonic, that are unable to speak, that on every different level are just incapacitated, then music is this key. And it's like, and we still don't understand how or why, or, you know, and it's just so fascinating, and it's so cosmic, you know.
You don't need to understand because we feel it. I don't need it explained. It doesn't need to be explained at all. It either works or it doesn't, and that's it.
No, totally. It either works or it doesn't. That's one of my one of the things I say, actually. It either works or it doesn't. And it's very and it's really honest in that way. It's like, it's just people, you know, it either does it, you can't fabricate it. you know.
And the weirdest thing I found, the only people who understand these kind of conversations, obviously other people in music or art who are in the same kind of area, but it's scientists. And I know quite a lot of scientists because you've done TEDx talks, haven't you? And it's amazing the backstage in it, because you get to meet the scientists who from CERN, and I've got to become very friendly with those people. And they talk in the same kind of way, you know, almost like science is creative in a way. And to be able to understand the universe, you have to look at it in terms of trying to understand music. You know, it's like digging into the conscious or into the forever, isn't it? Yeah,
totally.
And they totally, and they love music, and a lot of the older ones probably live very similar lifestyles to your dad did in the 60s as well. You know, some of the 75-year-old scientists, they look like they were tripping a lot of the 60s.
Yeah.
It's the only way they can work out the universe.